The Salt-Stained Hymnal, Chapter 8, A Story for the Dark. The world came back in a shriek of tearing metal and ragged breath. Joric Kantor was on his hands and knees, the grated steel of the catwalk digging into his palms. A violent shudder racked his frame, a full-body recoil from a ghost. He scrambled backward, crab-walking away from the source, his boots skidding on the slimy, rust-pocked surface. It was a pipe, a fat, arterial conduit that had burst its corroded seam. From the gash, a thick, shimmering cloud pulsed into the humid air, not like gas, but like a living thing exhaling. Billions of microscopic points of light, a nebula of sickly greens and ethereal blues, swirled in the stagnant twilight of the Gill-Racks. It was beautiful, utterly, damnably beautiful, and it smelled of honey and graves. He sucked in a desperate breath, the filters of his rebreather working overtime with an audible whine. The air still tasted sweet, tainted. Liana. Her name was a brand on the inside of his skull. The vision had been salt rot. It had been more than a vision. It was a memory made flesh, projected onto the swirling spore mist. His daughter, Liana, age 7. Not the pale, waterlogged memory he kept locked away, but vibrant, real. She'd been standing there, right in the heart of the glowing cloud, her small hand outstretched. She wasn't wearing the drab, utilitarian grays of benthos, but a yellow sundress he hadn't thought about in decades. A dress from before the deluge, before the drowned cradle had a name. Daddy, the memory of her voice echoed, clear as the drip of water from the ceiling high above. It doesn't have to hurt anymore. Joric slammed the heel of his palm against the side of his head, as if he could physically dislodge the phantom sound. No, he rasped, his own voice a stranger's croak inside his mask. Not real. Not real. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the afterimage was burned onto his retinas. The impossible sunlight in her hair, the specific gap between her two front teeth, the trusting, hopeful look in her eyes that he had failed to protect. A fungus couldn't know that. A pathogen couldn't replicate the exact, unique architecture of a specific, buried grief. Could it?
His wrist unit chose that moment to scream, a high-pitched, insistent alarm that cut through the low groan of the city's superstructure. He forced his trembling hand up, the screen a dizzying splash of orange and red alerts. Warning: atmospheric spore count exceeds safe limits by 12,000%. Psychoactive agents detected. Class 3 biohazard. Recommend immediate evacuation and decontamination. No kidding, Joric grunted. The mundane complaint to desperate anchor in a sea of madness. He jabbed a finger at the screen, silencing the audio alarm. The text remained, blinking accusations. He swiped to the detailed analysis, his mind clinging to the familiar comfort of data, of clinical detachment. Compound analysis. Unknown psilocybin derivative complexed with a novel retroviral vector. Estimated synaptic hijacking potential, 98.7%. Affects limbic system, memory recall, and prefrontal cortex. He read the words. He understood them. This was his job. Forensic theology. He debunked gods by dissecting their biology. This was just another pathogen, more sophisticated than most, but a pathogen nonetheless. It invaded the host, sifted through their deepest traumas and desires, and projected a bespoke salvation. A simple, cruel, and brutally efficient mechanism of propagation. His mind knew this. His training screened it. but his heart was a traitor, hammering against his ribs. It felt the ghost warmth of her small hand almost in his. He forced himself to breathe. In, hold, out. The rhythm of structured survivalism, the catechism of the faithless. Logic, efficiency, control. He was Joric Kantor, the debunker, the man who proved miracles were just misunderstood science, or more often, weaponized biology. He pushed himself up, his legs unsteady. He gripped the safety railing, the cold, wet metal a shock of reality. Below him, the chasm was a throat of absolute blackness, swallowing the weak orange emergency lights. The only other illumination came from the fungal blooms that clung to the weeping concrete walls far below, pulsing in a slow, silent rhythm, a heartbeat to rival the city's pumps. The pipe was still hissing. The beautiful, deadly cloud continued to expand, its tendrils reaching for him.
"It's a formula," he said aloud, his voice gaining a sliver of its usual cynical steel. It found the primary emotional nexus, familial loss, unresolved guilt. It generated a stimulus based on archived sensory data. Her face, her voice. "It's a trick of the light, a chemical lie." He repeated it like a prayer, the only prayer he had left. But the lie had been so perfect. It hadn't just shown him Liana. It had shown him the sun. He could still feel the phantom warmth on his skin, a sensation no one born in Benthos could even imagine. How did a fungus, born in the lightless, toxic deep, know the warmth of a star it had never seen? How could it replicate a feeling from a world that was already a myth? That was the part the data on his wrist couldn't explain. That was the splinter of terror that slid past his defenses, the fear he'd carried since the airy contracts office, that one day he'd find a God that wasn't a lie, and he'd have to face the truth that his family's death wasn't just a random, meaningless event, that it was a sacrifice for a faith he'd been too blind to see. "Salt rot!" he spat, turning his back on the ruptured pipe. He had to move. He had a job to do. Find the prophet, find the source, expose the fraud, reaffirm the cold, comforting meaninglessness of it all. He took one step, then another, his movements stiff, robotic. He was a machine recalibrating after a critical error. He reached the end of the catwalk, where it met a corroded stairwell descending deeper into the groaning dark of Gamma 9. He paused, his hand on the railing, listening. There was only the metronomic drip, drip, drip of water, the hiss of the spores behind him, and the deep bass hum of the city's heartbeat. And something else, so faint he thought it was the blood rushing in his own ears. A whisper, carried on the air currents, twisting through the labyrinth of pipes and concrete. It wasn't a memory this time. It was distant, and it was waiting. "Daddy?" He stood before the Citadel's main observation wall, a seamless pane of pre-deluge glass that presented a mosaic of the city's slow-motion collapse. 36 drone feeds tiled the display, each a silent window into a different circle of hell. Greasy blues and sickly greens bled from the pervasive bioluminescence below, painting the chaos in the palette of a disease. Here, a crowd swelling in Plaza Gamma 9, their faces pale and upturned in the chemical drizzle. There, a BCA patrol in heavy purity gear, their orange emergency lighting smearing across the wet polymer of a makeshift HAB unit. And everywhere, the water, dripping, seeping, pooling, the city's lifeblood and its poison. Colin's focus was a tight cluster of feeds centered on the lower Gill-Racks. Heat signatures bloomed in the gathered masses, a feverish red against the cool blue of the environment. The audio channels, muted to a low murmur, carried the distorted sound of 1,000 voices, a low hum that was almost, but not quite, a hymn. He traced the source of the gathering with a flick of his wrist, overlaying a schematic of the district's water infrastructure. They were converging on Cistern 7, just as the whispers predicted. He topped the polished chrome console beside him, the surface cool and unresponsive as a slab of mortuary steel. A new window materialized in the air, displaying a single vital signs feed. Joric Kantor. The theologian's biometrics were a mess. Heart rate, 112 BPM, erratic. Respiration, shallow, spiked with frequent holds. Galvanic skin response, a frantic sawtooth wave. Unacceptable metrics for a field operative. They were the numbers of a man running, or a man terrified. Colin considered the data for a long, silent moment. Kantor was his scalpel, a precise, if distasteful tool for a delicate excision. But a trembling scalpel was worse than useless. It was a liability. He activated the comms link. A hiss of static, then the channel clarified. Kantor, report. The reply was delayed. When it came, it was strained, breathy. Commander, I'm in position. Sector Gamma 8, sub-level 4. Colin didn't look away from the numbers dancing on the holographic display. Your biometrics suggest a state of agitation, Kantor. Is there something you've neglected to report? Another pause, longer this time. Kalin could hear the distant rhythmic drip of water through Joric's transmitter, the metronomic heartbeat of the city's decay. It was a sound he'd spent his entire career trying to silence. Environmental contaminants, Joric finally said, his voice a low rasp. Particulate count is high down here, affecting the suit's external sensors. A clean, efficient lie. Kalin almost admired it. But the suit's sensors were internal, hard-linked to Joric's own nervous system. They didn't measure the air, they measured the man, and the man was compromised. Kalin's jaw tightened, a barely perceptible shift in the hard lines of his face. He needed Kantor's assessment. He needed the theological pathology report that would label this whispering sickness a controllable contagion, a biological agent with a predictable vector. He needed the paperwork to justify the fire he intended to bring down on these sporeheads. A simple military purge was messy. It created martyrs. But a quarantine action? A necessary sterilization to protect the city's purity. That was structured survivalism. That was order. The particulates seem to be affecting your judgment as well, Kalin said, his tone flat, devoid of accusation, but heavy with its implication. You were to observe and report, not engage. I haven't engaged anyone, Joric shot back, a flicker of his old abrasive arrogance cutting through the fatigue. I was navigating a structural collapse. Kalin let the silence stretch out, a weapon in itself. On the main observation wall, the crowd near Cistern 7 swayed, a single organism moved by an unseen tide. He saw a child hoisted onto a man's shoulders, its face a mask of placid ecstasy. Salt rot. Our intelligence indicates the prophet, Silas, will make an appearance at Cistern 7 within the hour. They're claiming he will perform another miracle. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. He's going to bless the water. He watched Joric's heart rate spike again at the mention of the prophet. A flicker of fear. Or something else. Annoying. Joric's entire purpose was to dismantle the very idea of miracles, to reduce them to chemistry and mass hysteria. Yet the man's own body betrayed a primal reaction to the concept. The cistern is a primary distribution node for 3 subsectors, Kalen continued, his voice dropping to a low, serious tenor. If he introduces a high-concentration spore vector into that water supply, the infection rate will be catastrophic. We will lose the entire gamma sector by morning. I understand the stakes, Commander. Do you? Kalen allowed a sliver of ice into his voice. Because from my perspective, I have an asset in the field whose vital signs mirror those of the hysterics he's supposed to be analyzing. I need your professional assessment, Kantor, not your adrenaline. I need to know what this thing is. The silence from Joric's end was profound. Kalen could picture him there, in the dripping dark, surrounded by the sweet, cloying scent of fungal blossoms, the spores settling on him like a flying dust. He was swimming in the disease, and Kalen was asking him to describe the water. It's more complex than that, Joric finally managed, his voice barely a whisper. Frustration, cold and sharp, pricked at the edge of Kalen's composure. That is not an answer, theologian. That is an evasion. Your mission parameters are updated. Proceed to an overwatch position at CISTERN 7. I want high-resolution scans of Silas himself, and I want samples of whatever he puts in that water. You are authorized to use your tranquilizer darts for sample acquisition only. Do you understand? No direct contact. Understood. The reply was clipped, resigned. Kalen terminated the connection without another word. Joric's biometric feed vanished, and he was alone again with the silent, panoramic view of his dying city. His gaze fell upon the drone feed showing the child on the man's shoulders. The child was smiling now, a wide, unnatural smile, as a faint greenish-gold luminescence began to trace the veins on its cheeks. They weren't just being infected, they were being converted. They were happy about it. He knew, with a certainty that went deeper than data, that Joric would fail. The theologian was too close, too entangled in the philosophical weeds of faith and meaning. He saw a mystery to be solved. Kalen saw only a disease that needed to be cauterized. And if the scalpel broke, he would have to use an axe. The plaza around Cistern 7 was a wound in the heart of the Gill-Racks, weeping rust and despair. Joric stood under the dripping overhang of a repurposed cargo hauler, the perpetual drizzle beading on the collar of his worn synth-leather coat. The air was thick enough to chew, a foul cocktail of ozone from a nearby power conduit, the metallic tang of corrosion, and something else, something sweet and cloying, like honey left to rot in a damp cellar. The murmuration's signature scent. He hated it. Before him, the crowd pressed in on itself, a single breathing organism of misery. Hundreds of the damps, their faces sallow and gaunt under the greasy blue-green glow of fungal patches on the far walls. They were a gallery of hollowed cheeks and sunken eyes, their clothes little more than patched rags perpetually damp from the weeping ceiling. They didn't shout, they didn't riot. The energy for that had been leached out of them generations ago. They simply waited, a vast, silent congregation of thirst, their collective gaze fixed on the focal point of their world, a single armored spigot jutting from the pockmarked concrete belly of Cistern 7. From the spigot, rationed water dripped out with agonizing slowness. Drip, drip, drip. Each drop was a sacrament, catching the sickly orange emergency light before vanishing into the grimy canister of the person whose turn it was. A metronome counting down the city's slow death. Flanking the cistern were the instruments of order. 4 Benthos Consolidation Authority enforcers stood immobile, their environmental armor making them look like hulking chitinous insects. Their faceplates were mirrored voids, reflecting the desperate faces before them without betraying a flicker of humanity. Joric watched a woman, her hair thin and plastered to her skull, get denied. Her balance was empty. She didn't plead. She didn't cry. Her face just collapsed, all the bones in it suddenly seeming too heavy for her skin. She shuffled away, swallowed by the crowd, another ghost in the machine. He ran a hand over his face, the stubble rasping against his palm. His job was to find the source of the fungal faith, to trace it back to a leaky pipe or a contaminated food source, to prove Silas was just another charlatan preying on the weak. But looking at this, he understood. He didn't pity them. Pity was a luxury, a waste of calories. But he understood the fertile ground he was standing in. Hope wasn't a virtue here. It was a symptom of a terminal condition. The murmuration didn't need to be pushed. It was being pulled into the vacuum left by this cold, dripping reality. Then the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't a sound, not at first. It was a change in pressure, a subtle realignment of the crowd's collective posture. Heads began to turn. The metronomic focus on the dripping spigot wavered. A murmur, soft as moss, began to spread through the bodies. Joric pushed himself away from the wall, his senses on high alert. He followed their gaze. They emerged from the gloom of a connecting catwalk, not with any grand entrance, but as if they had simply coalesced out of the shadows. 3 of them. The hymners. They wore the same damp rags as everyone else, but they moved with a placid grace that was utterly alien to the weary shuffling of the plaza. The man in the lead had a face of serene emptiness, his eyes unfocused, as if he were looking at a horizon no one else could see. On his neck, just below his ear, a faint, lacy pattern of blue-green bioluminescence pulsed softly, in time with the city's deep, groaning heartbeat. The whispering sickness, worn like a holy sigil.
They didn't speak, not with words. The man raised a hand, not in greeting, but as if to feel the texture of the thick air, and then he began to hum. It was a low, resonant tone, a sound that seemed to come not just from his throat, but from his entire chest cavity. It vibrated in the damp concrete, in the soles of Joric's boots, in the very water molecules hanging in the air. The other 2 joined in, their voices weaving harmonies that were both beautiful and profoundly wrong. They were melodies without structure, chords that resolved in ways that made the teeth ache. The effect on the crowd was immediate and terrifying. It was like watching ice crystals form on a pane of glass. The weary desperation didn't vanish, it was transfigured. A woman who had been coughing raggedly into a cloth fell silent, her body swaying gently. A man with a twitching, palsied hand slowly unclenched his fist. The desperate, hungry light in their eyes was replaced by something else, a placid, vacant receptiveness. The faint, dangerous hope Joric had been expecting wasn't a fire. It was a frost, a calm, creeping numbness that promised an end to pain. "He is coming," a woman near Joric breathed, her voice raspy with disuse. "Silas, he will make the waters sweet again." "Salt rot!" one of the BCA enforcers barked, his voice distorted and metallic through his helmet's external speaker. "Disperse! Unsanctioned gathering is a Class 3 violation!" He raised his pulse rifle, its charging coils whining with a sharp electric hum that cut through the hymner's song. But no one moved. No one even seemed to hear him. The hundreds of gaunt faces were now turned as one toward the hymners, their expressions identically serene. The low, resonant hum grew louder, no longer just from the three acolytes. Others in the crowd were picking it up, their voices joining the dissonant choir. A low, swelling chorus that promised oblivion. The sweet, rotting scent in the air intensified, and Joric could almost taste it on his tongue. The enforcers exchanged glances, their rigid armored postures suddenly betraying a sliver of uncertainty. Their weapons were designed to control riots, to intimidate individuals. They had no protocol for this. How do you threaten a congregation that has already embraced its own end? Joric felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. This wasn't a simple cult. This wasn't a preacher spinning lies for cow leaders and favors. He was watching a competing organism asserting its dominance. The BCA offered a slow, measured, and miserable existence, one drop at a time. The murmuration offered a different kind of salvation. It didn't promise to fill their canisters. It promised to extinguish their thirst entirely. He pulled his collar tighter, the familiar chill of the Gill-Racks suddenly feeling much, much colder. The investigation had just begun, and he already felt like an anthropologist studying the last moments of a species before its quiet, willing extinction. The air before CISTERN-7 was a thick, unpalatable soup. It tasted of ozone from a nearby conduit arcing erratically, and the cloying fungal sweetness that was becoming the city's new perfume. Joric stood near the back of the crowd, his collar pulled high, the recycled air from his personal scrubber a thin, sterile defense against the miasma. Hundreds of damps were packed onto the grimy plaza, a sea of patched coveralls and gaunt faces, all turned toward the wide, weeping steps of the water reclamation unit. The mood wasn't rebellious, it was worse. It was exhausted hope, a desperate, final scraping of the soul's empty bowl. His gaze swept over them, a clinical assessment. Posture, defeated. Skin tone, sallow, indicative of algae-paste diet deficiencies. Eyes, wide, hungry for something other than nutrient rations. They were textbook candidates for a mimetic contagion, a faith plague. 4 BCA purity enforcers stood in a loose cordon at the base of the steps, their orange-striped armor a violent slash against the perpetual blue-green twilight. Their helmeted heads swiveled, impersonal and insect-like. They weren't engaging, just watching, waiting. Kalen's orders, Joric suspected. Contain, observe, and let the new god show his hand before they smashed it.
The great pump within the cistern, the district's heartbeat cycled with a deep, resonant groan that vibrated through the soles of Joric's boots. A metronome for the dying. Then a change. Not a sound, but a cessation of it. The nervous shuffling and whispered coughing of the crowd died away, replaced by a collective, held breath. A vacuum of anticipation.
Joric's first analysis was a string of negations. No guards, no acolytes in dramatic robes, no grand entrance. The man who called himself Silas was barefoot. The sight was a visceral shock in the filth of the Gill-Racks. His feet, pale and clean against the rust-stained permacrete, were a statement of impossible purity. He was thin, wrapped in a simple, undyed tunic that might have been scavenged from a pre-deluge burial shroud. He moved with a liquid economy, a serenity that was utterly alien to the frantic, shoulder-hunched survival shuffle of every other soul in Benthos. He stopped halfway down the steps, not looming over them, but positioning himself amongst them. He didn't look at anyone in particular, his gaze soft, unfocused, as if watching a current no one else could see. Joric felt a flicker of professional contempt, theatrics, calculated vulnerability. The bare feet are a classic messianic trope, meant to evoke a connection to the earth, or in this case, the grime. It's a symbol of rejecting the sterile artifice of the airy. He catalogued the details for his report. Then Silas spoke. Joric was braced for a shout, a booming proclamation amplified by hidden tech. Instead, a whisper slipped into the humid air. "You are thirsty," Silas said. It wasn't a question. It was a simple statement of fact, yet it landed with the force of a physical blow. The whisper should have been consumed by the groan of the cistern, by the ceaseless drip of water from the levels above. It wasn't. It carried, weaving through the oppressive hum, finding its way into every ear as if spoken directly beside it. Joric's eyes narrowed, scanning the archways, the gantries above. A distributed audio system? Phased array speakers? There had to be a technical explanation. "The authority gives you water," the whisper continued, serene and melodic, "and you drink. They give you paste, and you eat. They give you orders, and you obey. But you are still thirsty." The crowd swayed, a single organism, mesmerized. No one moved to shout amens or affirmations. They just listened, their faces slack with a desperate attention Joric had only ever seen in terminal patients listening to a doctor's final diagnosis. This wasn't a rally. It was a communion.
The lead enforcer, his helmet designated with a single thick orange stripe, took a heavy step forward. His rifle was held at a low ready, a gesture of casual intimidation that had lost all its menace.
"This is an unsanctioned gathering." The enforcer's voice crackled through his helmet's external vocoder, a harsh, digitized intrusion. "Disperse immediately. Failure to comply is a purity violation." Silas did not turn. He did not acknowledge the enforcer's existence. He simply took another step down, his bare foot landing silently on the damp stone. He brought his hands together before his chest, not in prayer, but as if holding a cup. "They tell you hope is a sickness," Silas murmured, his voice a balm against the enforcer's grating command. "They tell you faith is a waste of precious energy. They have built a world of perfect, structured survival, and left no room for a reason to survive." Pathogenic rhetoric, Joric thought, his fingers itching for a data slate to take notes. He's reframing their core fears. Water, the great enemy, is now a medium for salvation. Salt rot, the ultimate curse, becomes a sacrament. It's brilliant, and it's pure poison. The enforcer took another step, his partner shifting nervously beside him. Final warning. Disperse, or we will deploy compliance measures. The threat hung in the air, but it was hollow. To use their sonic dampeners or shock mauls now, on this silent, unmoving crowd, would be an act of butchery, not enforcement. And they knew it. The crowd wasn't threatening them. They were ignoring them, their entire reality narrowed to the slight man in the simple robe. Silas finally turned his head, just slightly. His eyes, the color of the deep bioluminescent waters of the bloom deeps, found the lead enforcer. "He is thirsty too," he said, and the simple pity in his voice was more disarming than any threat. "His soul is dry." The enforcer froze. Joric could almost feel the man's conflict through the armor plating. Decades of training, of rigid adherence to protocol, warring against an unnerving, deeply human moment. He was no longer a symbol of authority. He was just a man, being offered a drink.
The enforcer took a single, shuffling step back, a retreat, a surrender. His partners followed suit, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, but it was a tectonic event in the rigid power structure of Benthos. Joric felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. This was not a simple cult leader. This was a biological event in human form. The tension that had held the plaza broke, not into chaos, but into a wave of quiet awe. A collective sigh of relief and wonder rippled through the damps. A woman near Joric began to weep silently, tears carving clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. An old man sank to his knees, his head bowed. Silas's gaze lifted from the defeated enforcers and swept across the crowd. For a sickening, heart-stopping second, his eyes met Joric's. There was no fire in them, no zealot's fury. There was only a calm, ancient, and deeply intelligent awareness. It was the look of a biologist observing a new specimen in a petri dish, a look of recognition. In that moment, Joric wasn't a hunter studying his prey. He was a cell being observed by the organism. The whisper came one last time, meant for all, but Joric felt it as a spike driven directly into his skull. "The hymnal is open. Come and drink." As one, the crowd began to move forward, a slow, inexorable tide of bodies surging toward the steps, drawn by a gravity Joric could not measure. He stood his ground, an island of cold reason in a river of faith. The sweet, rotten scent of the murmuration was suddenly overwhelming, and the familiar ache of a spore-induced migraine began to bloom behind his temples. He had come to observe a fraud. He had found a prophet. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him more than the endless damp. There was no God here, only a contagion that had learned how to pray. The gantry shuddered under Joric's weight, a low groan of rusted metal protesting in the damp air. Below, Cyst 7 was a vast concrete maw, and gathered at its lip was a congregation of the city's forgotten, the Damps. Their drab, moisture-stained clothes blended into the gray-green twilight of the Gill-Racks, a single organism of misery drawn to a new hope. Joric ignored them. Hope was a variable he couldn't quantify, and therefore it was a distraction.
His hands, however, were not so easily convinced. A fine tremor ran through his fingers as he unlatched the battered case of his portable spectrometer. He placed the device on the grated floor, its diagnostic lights casting a sickly orange glow on his worn knuckles. The air was thick with the trinity of benthos scents, the ozone tang of a nearby power conduit arcing, the pervasive damp of weeping concrete, and beneath it all, the reason he was here, the cloying honey and rot perfume of the murmuration. It clung to the back of his throat like a sweet poison. Baseline first, he muttered to himself, the words of familiar ritual, a shield of process against the chaos. His voice was a dry rasp. Atmospheric spore density, particulate composition, psychoactive alkaloid signatures. He worked with a practiced, almost frantic efficiency, connecting a filtration nozzle and calibrating the intake sensor. The machine whirred to life, its low hum a counter-rhythm to the city's deep, metronomic heartbeat, the distant thrum of the master pumps. Focus on the data. The data doesn't lie. The data can't hurt you. He ran a diagnostic, the screen filling with scrolling lines of amber code. Everything nominal for a piece of scavenged pre-deluge tech held together by grim determination and soldering paste. Good enough. Joric straightened up, his back cracking a protest, and peered over the railing. From this vantage, 200 feet up, the prophet Silas was just a man. Tall, gaunt, dressed in the same salt-stained rags as his followers. He stood beside the cistern's main sluice gate, one hand resting on the weeping metal as if comforting an old beast. He wasn't preaching. He was just present. And the crowd was utterly silent, their upturned faces bathed in the soft, blue-green bioluminescence pulsing from the mycelial veins that had webbed the entire cistern wall. A miracle of purified water. Salt rot. A biological parlor trick, nothing more.
Joric raised a pair of electro-binoculars, twisting the dial to magnify Silas's face. He needed a visual assessment. Subject appears malnourished but calm. No visible signs of advanced mutation. Pupils dilated, but that was to be expected in this perpetual gloom. He swept the view across the crowd, cataloging the faces. Desperation, exhaustion, and something else he refused to name. He saw a mother clutching a gaunt child, an old man whose face was a mask of placid awe, standard cult behavior, textbook. Then he saw it, a flicker of impossible color in the sea of gray and brown. Red, a child's rain slicker, bright as fresh blood. It was small, lost in the crush of bodies. His thumb froze on the focus dial. He blinked, hard. The slicker was gone. Just a trick of the light, a phantom signal from the emergency beacons refracting through the ever-present mist. Ocular fatigue, he diagnosed aloud, turning back to his spectrometer. Symptom of prolonged exposure to low-light, high-contaminant environments. He tapped the screen, forcing a new diagnostic to run. The tremor in his hands had worsened. He couldn't shake the image. It was the exact shade of the slicker he'd bought for Leah, her 7th birthday. He'd traded 3 cal of his own water ration for it on the black market, a ridiculous extravagance, a foolish, emotional act. Her face when she'd seen it. No. The word was a piece of gravel in his throat. He gripped the spectrometer's housing, the cold metal biting into his palm. Pathogenic influence. Spores are active. Class 4 myconeurotoxin, known to interface with the memory centers of the hippocampus. He recited the facts like a prayer against heresy. This was the infection talking, using his own memories as a weapon. A simple biological process. Understand it, dissect it, control it. He risked another look through the binoculars, his heart hammering a frantic, unwelcome rhythm against his ribs. This time he was slower, more methodical.
He scanned the rows of faces, his breath held tight in his chest. He swept past the old man, the tired mother, there, the red slicker, and the child wearing it. She was half turned away from him, looking up at Silas. A cascade of dark hair, just like Leah's, spilled from under the hood. She was small for her age, always was. The thought surfaced, unbidden, ancient. He zoomed in, the magnification whining as the servos strained. The image pixelated, stabilized. The child shifted, turning her head just enough for him to see her profile. The curve of her cheek, the small upturned nose. His breath hitched. The air left his lungs in a silent rush, as if punched out of him. The gantry, the cistern, the entire groaning city dissolved into a peripheral blur. There was only that face. His professional detachment, the carefully constructed dam of nihilism he'd spent a decade building, cracked from foundation to summit. Leah! The name felt alien on his tongue, a relic from another life. The girl below raised a hand and pointed toward the glowing mycelium on the cistern wall, her finger outstretched. It was the same gesture Leah used to make when she saw the bioluminescent jellies in the reclamation tanks, a gesture of pure, unfiltered wonder. A ghost of a memory so vivid it felt like a physical blow. Joric stumbled back, away from the railing, his shoulder hitting a rusted support beam with a dull thud. He squeezed his eyes shut. "It's not her," he hissed through gritted teeth. "She's dead. You were there. You held her." The spectrometer beside him emitted a sharp beep, signaling the completion of its atmospheric analysis. The sound was shrill, intrusive, an unwelcome anchor to a reality that was rapidly losing its purchase. He forced his eyes open and stared at the device's glowing screen. Numbers, data, spore concentration, 4,000 parts per million. Alkaloid signature consistent with psilocybin and 2 unidentified neuroreactive compounds. Logical. Explainable. The proof was right there, a clinical diagnosis for his own haunting. But as he stared at the amber text, his own reflection stared back from the dark screen, the face of a hollowed-out man, and for a terrifying, heart-stopping second, looking over his shoulder in the reflection, he saw the faint outline of a little girl in a red rain slicker.
The plaza of CIS-TRN-7 was a wound in the city's flesh, a wide, weeping space carved out of corroded superstructure. Above, the underbellies of higher levels bled a constant greasy drizzle that slicked the graded floor. Below, the cistern itself was a vast circular maw of stagnant water, reflecting the sickly orange of the emergency beacons in a shattered mirror. The air, thick enough to chew, was a trinity of scents. The ozone tang of a nearby air scrubber fighting a losing battle, the wet dog smell of 100 unwashed bodies, and beneath it all, the sweet, cloying perfume of rot that was the murmuration's signature. Joric stood apart from the crowd, his back pressed against a support pillar weeping rust-colored tears. He was an island of sterile gray in a sea of patched, damp-stained coveralls. The damps of Gamma 9 were packed tight, a congregation of hollowed eyes and gaunt faces, their collective hope, a palpable, pathetic thing. They weren't looking up at the perpetually leaking ceiling for salvation, but at the man who stood on a makeshift dais at the system's edge, Silas, the first hymner. He was unremarkable, a scarecrow of a man draped in scavenged fabric, but he possessed a stillness that drew the eye, a calm that was an obscenity in the constant groaning decay of benthos. Joric raised his wrist-mounted scanner, its screen a cracked but functional pane of light. He thumbed the diagnostic suite online, the device's quiet hum a familiar prayer of logic in this temple of delusion. His job was simple. Observe, analyze, dissect the miracle. Find the string that makes the puppet dance. Silas raised his hands. He didn't speak. Flanking him, a dozen of his hymners, faces serene, pupils dilated, drew a breath in unison. And then the chant began. It wasn't a song, it was a frequency, a low, resonant drone that started in their chests and seemed to emanate directly from the metal and concrete of the plaza itself. It was the sound of the city's own heartbeat, the deep thrum of the reclamation pumps, but harmonized, given a terrifying living purpose. The sound bypassed the ears and sank straight into Joric's bones. He felt his teeth vibrate.
His scanner chirped, a soft, insistent tone. He glanced down. The audio spectrograph was painting a picture he didn't like. The chant wasn't a simple vocalization. It was a complex waveform, layered and impossibly stable. No ragged human edges, just a pure, clean signal. Almost manufactured. He switched the sensor suite to atmospheric analysis. He expected this part. The display flickered and a cascade of numbers scrolled past. Particulate density 789 ppm. Class mycological, type 7 murmuration. A massive spike. Standard procedure for a hymner gathering. Silas was a walking spore cloud, a typhoid Mary for a new kind of God. The crowd was breathing it in, a sacrament of airborne pathogens. Cross-spectrum analysis initiated, the scanner's tinny voice announced in his earbead. Joric watched the faces in the crowd. Their slack-jawed anticipation was morphing. Eyelids fluttered. Shoulders relaxed. The desperate tension that defined every damp in benthos began to unspool. A woman near the front, her face a roadmap of malnutrition and worry, smiled a faint, beatific smile. It was the whispering sickness, stage 1, happening in real time on a mass scale. A chemical hijacking of the brain's pleasure centers. Textbook. And yet, the hum deepened, the vibration intensified. It felt as though a giant tuning fork had been struck somewhere in the Bloom deeps, and the entire city was its resonator. Alert! Anomalous resonance detected. Joric's gaze snapped back to his scanner. The screen displayed two waveforms superimposed on each other. One was the audio frequency of the chant. The other was an energy reading from the airborne spores themselves. They were identical, perfectly, mathematically identical. Salt rot. That wasn't possible. He ran the diagnostic again. Spores were inert particulates. They drifted, they inhaled. They did not, could not, resonate with a sound wave like microscopic crystals. It defied biology. It defied physics. He frantically scrolled through his internal database, searching for any known phenomenon, bioacoustic coupling, piezo-mycelial effect, anything, but found nothing. His science, his faith, had no name for this. This was the trick, the beautiful, impossible trick. The air grew heavy, the sweet scent of fungal bloom becoming almost overpowering, a smell like honey poured over a grave. Joric felt a sudden dizzying wave of vertigo. For a half-second, the crowd of gaunt faces blurred, and in their place he saw a phantom image, a small girl with his wife's eyes, her hand reaching for his. Leah. He blinked hard, the hallucination shattering like glass. A side effect of the spore concentration, he knew that, but the ache it left behind was real. He forced himself to focus on the cistern. The water was a black soup, shimmering with chemical slicks and filth, the collected refuse of 1,000 leaking pipes. And it was beginning to glow. It started as a pinprick in the center, a faint, swampy phosphorescence, not a reflection, a light from within. The crowd saw it too. A collective indrawn breath, a sound of pure wonder rippled through the plaza. The chant of the hymner swelled, the vibration reaching a painful, all-consuming pitch. The glow spread. It pulsed in time with the chant, a sickly green varicose vein expanding in the dark water. Then the color began to shift. The putrid green brightened, clarifying, turning to an ethereal aquamarine, and then to a brilliant, clean blue-white that pushed back the orange gloom of the emergency lights. It didn't look like bioluminescence. It looked pure. Alert! Water purity analysis indicates rapid reduction in Class 3 contaminants and microbial pathogens. The scanner's voice was a deadpan blasphemy in the sacred silence. Joric stared, his knuckles white where he gripped the device. He was watching a miracle through the lens of a machine, and the machine was telling him the miracle was real. The fungus wasn't just glowing. It was actively consuming the toxins, the bacteria, the very filth of benthos, and converting it into light and clean water. The chant stopped. Silence crashed down, profound and absolute, broken only by the steady drip of the city. The glow in the cistern remained, a serene, holy beacon in the heart of the filth. A young man at the edge of the water fell to his knees, weeping, and cupped the glowing liquid in his hands, drinking deeply as if it were the nectar of life itself. One by one, the others followed, a tide of wretched, hopeful humanity surging forward, their faces illuminated by the impossible light. Their reverence was a physical force, an answer to a prayer they had forgotten how to speak. They had been offered a God that didn't demand faith, but rewarded it with a full belly and a clean drink. Joric didn't move. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. His scanner still displayed the data, the impossible resonance, the localized purification. It was evidence, undeniable proof, but it wasn't proof of a fraud. It was proof of a power that operated outside the rigid laws of his world. He had come here to find a pathogen, to label it, to understand its mechanism, and thereby render it meaningless.
Then Silas emerged. He wasn't what Joric expected. No grand robes, no booming voice. He was a slight man, deceptively young, clad in the same patched synth weaves as the crowd. The only thing that set him apart was the faint, sickly green luminescence that pulsed gently under the skin of his forearms, like trapped lightning. The crowd did not cheer. A reverent hush fell over them, a silence so profound it felt louder than the noise it replaced. Silas walked to the edge of the platform, his bare feet stopping inches from the foul water. He raised his hands, not in a gesture of power, but of invitation. His voice, when he spoke, was not amplified, yet it carried across the cavernous space a soft, resonant tone that seemed to bypass the ears and settle directly in the bones. "The authority gives you rationed poison," he began, his voice calm, measured. "They call it
purity. They measure your lives in calibrated liters of filtered despair. They tell you hope is a sickness, that faith is a weakness. Joric's jaw tightened. Classic rhetoric. Identify the oppressor, validate the suffering of the masses, offer a competing product. It was page 1 of the cult leader's handbook. They are wrong, Silas continued, his gaze sweeping over the upturned faces. Your thirst is not a flaw. It is a prayer, and tonight the murmuration will answer. He knelt, his movements fluid and unhurried. He reached down and dipped his right hand into the sludge. For a moment, nothing happened. A few nervous coughs echoed in the cistern. Joric leaned forward, narrowing his eyes, trying to spot the hidden dispenser, the chemical catalyst, the acoustic device. There was always a trick. Then he saw it. A single point of light, no bigger than a pinprick, bloomed on Silas's fingertip. It was the color of the bloom deeps, a spectral blue-green that was both beautiful and deeply unnatural. It pulsed once in time with the city's heartbeat. Then it began to spread. It wasn't a diffusion, not a chemical bleed, it was a growth. Veins of light, intricate as a leaf skeleton and bright as captured stars, raced out from his hand. They branched and rebranched, forming a breathtaking fractal web across the water's surface. Joric's slate began to chime, a frantic, escalating series of alerts, water toxicity plummeting, particulate matter count collapsing. It was impossible.
The filaments of light dove deeper, illuminating the massive tank from within. The water, once an opaque filth, became a swirling cosmos of glowing, ethereal networks. Joric watched, mesmerized, as the mycelial lattice visibly attacked the impurities. Clumps of sludge were swarmed, broken down, and consumed by light. The thick brown of the water thinned to a murky gray, then a translucent haze, and then, with a final collective pulse that washed the entire cistern in its ghostly light, it became clear, impossibly clear. Joric could see the rusted, pock-marked floor of the cistern, 50 feet below, every crack and seam rendered in perfect detail, as if viewed through pre-deluge glass. The process had taken less than a minute. The sweet, cloying scent of fungal blossoms, like honey and decay, erupted through the space, completely overwhelming the stench of rot. It was the smell of the murmuration, the scent of conversion. But here, on this scale, it was intoxicating, divine. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of 1,000 people having their reality dismantled. Joric found he was holding his breath, his knuckles white where he gripped the railing. His mind, his entire professional and personal existence, was a frantic scramble for explanation. A tailored bioagent? A nanite swarm? Nothing he knew of could work this fast, this efficiently, this beautifully. This was not a trick. Silas rose slowly. He picked up a simple, battered tin cup from the platform. With a steady hand, he dipped it into the water. It came up brimming with liquid so pure it seemed to bend the emergency lights into rainbows. He held it up for all to see. Then he drank. He tilted his head back and drained the entire cup in a long, slow swallow. His throat worked. His eyes were closed in something that looked like bliss. He lowered the cup, a single drop of perfect water rolling from his lip down his chin. He opened his eyes,
and they seemed to glow with a faint internal luminescence. He looked out at the stunned, silent crowd. He smiled, a gentle, compassionate expression. "Drink," he said, his voice a soft command, "and be free of thirst."
He stepped forward and offered the still dripping cup to an old woman at the front of the crowd. Her hand trembled as she took it. She stared into it as if it held the secrets of the universe, then brought it to her lips and drank. Her eyes widened, a sob tore from her throat, a sound of such profound, wrenching relief that it broke the spell of silence. That sob was the breaking of a dam. The crowd surged forward, not with violence, but with a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated need. People fell to their knees at the cistern's edge, weeping, laughing. They plunged their hands, their faces into the pristine water. The sounds of desperate, joyful drinking filled the air, punctuated by cries of "a miracle" and "he loves us." The awe had shattered into ecstatic release. Joric stumbled back from the railing, a cold sweat on his brow. The sight below was not one of religious fervor. It was a mass surrender. He was witnessing the birth of a God not in fire or scripture, but in a simple cup of clean water. The BCA's narrative, their doctrine of structured survivalism, their entire basis of control, it hadn't just been challenged, it had been rendered utterly, laughably obsolete. This was a force that didn't need to be explained or debunked. It simply was. And in the shimmering reflection on the water's surface, we could almost see a small girl with his eyes, smiling at him. The thought that followed was cold, sharp, and terrifying. What if the hope isn't the sickness? What if the cure is? The silence in the plaza was a physical weight. It pressed down with the humidity in the perpetual gray twilight, broken only by the metronomic drip of condensation from a corroded pipe overhead. Before us, CISTERN 7, a massive concrete basin slick with generations of grime, now held something impossible, water, that didn't just look clean, it shimmered. A trick of the light, my mind insisted, a chemical reaction. The sickly green bioluminescence of the mycelial bloom that had choked it moments before was gone, leaving a clarity so profound it seemed to drink the meager orange light of the emergency fixtures.
Between me and that impossible water stood a line of BCA enforcers, their black composite armor streaked with moisture, riot shields locked together. Their carbines were leveled not at a riot, but at a congregation holding its collective breath. Hundreds of damps, their faces gaunt and gray in the gloom, packed the plaza. Their eyes, wide and hungry, were fixed on the cistern. They didn't look at the guns. They didn't seem to see them. "Hold the line!" The captain's voice, amplified by his helmet's external speaker, was a blade of static cutting through the quiet. "Section leaders, report! Maintain perimeter discipline! That water is sump-tainted. Lethal contamination protocols are in effect." Lies. It was always lies. The BCA's truth was whatever kept the pumps running and the algae paste flowing. But this was a different kind of truth, and it was spreading faster than any pathogen I had ever documented. Then she moved. An old woman, her back bent into a permanent question mark from a life in the Gill-Racks, shuffled out from the front of the crowd. Her feet, wrapped in rags, made a soft, wet sound on the grated floor. The enforcers tensed. The barrels of their rifles tracked her slow, inexorable progress. "Halt!" the captain barked. "One more step and we open fire. That is a final warning." She didn't even flinch. It wasn't defiance. It was as if his words were in a language she no longer understood. Her focus was absolute. She reached the lip of the cistern, her gnarled fingers, stained with rust and nutrient paste, trembling as they neared the surface. The crowd was a statue. I could feel my own heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic, caged thing. It's a psychoactive agent, I thought, my professional detachment a flimsy shield against the sheer unreality of the moment. Aerosolized during the purification, mass suggestion. She's a puppet. Her fingers dipped into the water. She cupped a handful, the clear liquid impossibly bright against her skin. She brought it to her lips. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The captain's eyes opened to shout another order, but the sound died in his throat.
The woman's eyes, clouded with cataracts and decades of despair, cleared. It was like watching the sun rise behind them. A shudder ran through her frail body, not of poison, but of release. A single, profound sigh escaped her lips, a sound of such perfect, unadulterated bliss that it echoed in the cavernous space, a note of impossible harmony against the city's groaning dissonance. She stood up straight, the painful stoop of her spine gone. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of sorrow. She was smiling. A beatific expression I had only ever seen on the faces of the bloomed in their final, ecstatic moments. She laughed, a soft, gentle sound. Then she drank again, deeply, thirstily. That was the breaking of the dam. The crowd didn't roar. It sighed. A single, unified exhalation of hope and desperation that washed over the BCA line like a physical wave. They surged forward, not with anger, but with reverence. They pushed against the shields, their hands outstretched, desperate not to fight, but to reach. They were pilgrims, and the cistern was their shrine. "Fire! Fire a warning shot!" the captain screamed, his voice now laced with panic. A single rifle cracked, the sound deafening. The shot ricocheted off a steel girder high above, sending a shower of rust flakes down. No one stopped. No one even looked up. A young man, no older than 20, pressed his face against the transparent shield of an enforcer. "Brother," he wept, his voice muffled, "it's a miracle. The water is a gift. Can't you see?" The enforcer, a boy himself under that helmet, stared back. I saw his rifle barrel tremble. I saw his gaze flick from the desperate face before him to the glowing, pure water behind him. The sweet scent of the murmuration, honey and damp earth, and something ancient, was everywhere now, thick and cloying. It coated the throat. It was the smell of conversion. "It's in the air," my mind screamed. "Spores. He's breathing it. They're all breathing it. The water is just the delivery system, the final sacrament."
Another enforcer, then another, lowered their weapons. The shield wall began to buckle, not from the pressure of the crowd, but from its own dissolving will. The damps flowed through the gaps like water themselves. They fell to their knees at the edge of the cistern, scooping the water with their hands, with scavenged cups, with their mouths directly from the surface. And with every drink, the same transformation, the same shudder of ecstasy, the same tears of joy. The plaza was filled with the sound of weeping and soft, reverent laughter. Hold the line," the captain stammered, his authority stripped bare. His voice was a ghost. He was witnessing the end of his world, the complete and utter failure of structured survivalism in the face of a single, beautiful lie. Then came the hymn. It started as a low hum, a vibration I felt in my teeth. It grew, one voice joining another, then a dozen, then 100. It was a sound with no words, a melody of pure communal release. It was the most beautiful and terrifying thing I had ever heard. It was the sound of humanity dissolving. My hand went to the spore filter on my mask, ensuring the seal was tight, but it was a useless gesture. I was already breathing it. I could already feel it trying to find the cracks in my soul. I watched an enforcer, a big man with sergeant stripes on his armor, drop his rifle. It clattered to the floor with a final, metallic finality. He took off his helmet. His face was streaked with sweat and tears. He looked at the scene, his mouth agape, not in horror, but in raw, naked awe. He stumbled toward the cistern. He knelt. Salt rot. It was over. This wasn't just a loss of control over a district. This was a paradigm shift. The BCA's only weapon, fear, was useless against a god that offered bliss. Kalen Rask couldn't execute his way out of this. You can't kill a belief when it gives people a reason to die smiling. I backed away, melting into the deep shadows of a service corridor. The hymn swelled behind me, a living, breathing entity that was consuming the plaza, consuming the people, consuming the very idea of the city I knew. My mission was to debunk a prophet, to prove him a fraud. But what I had just witnessed, it wasn't a trick. It was a weapon that didn't destroy the body, but annihilated the self with kindness. And it was more effective than any gun.
I turned and fled, the sound of that terrible, joyous choir chasing me down the dripping, darkened halls. The hymn began as a vibration, a low thrum that Joric felt in the rusted durasteel gantry beneath his boots before he truly heard it. Below, in the cavernous basin of Cistern 7, the great miracle was complete. The water, once brackish and filmed with chemical scum, now shimmered with an impossible clarity, glowing with a soft internal luminescence. A sea of faces, upturned and awestruck, reflected its greasy blue light. They were damps, hundreds of them, their faces etched with the desperation of life in the Gill-Racks, and now that desperation was dissolving. Joric watched from his perch, his knuckles white on the safety rail. His rebreather hissed a steady rhythm, scrubbing the spore-thick air. A sterile mechanical counterpoint to the organic, rising chorus below. He kept his gaze clinical, his mind a fortress of structured analysis. Bioluminescent algae, engineered to react with specific contaminants, he cataloged internally, his thoughts a dry recitation against the rising tide of awe. The reaction purifies the water while releasing a mild euphoric neurotoxin. Silas didn't make water into wine. He just dosed the municipal supply. It was elegant. It was terrifyingly effective. But it was biology, not divinity. The first of the crowd knelt at the cistern's edge, cupping the glowing water in their hands. They drank, and the change was immediate. A shudder passed through them, a visible tremor. Their eyes, wide with thirst, went wider still with something else. A vacant, blissful peace. A man dropped his empty canteen. It clattered on the wet concrete, a sharp, profane sound in the growing hum of the hymn. No one noticed. One by one, they drank. The hymn swelled, no longer a simple hum, but a complex, multitonal chord that seemed to resonate with the very architecture of the city, with the deep groan of the superstructures and the constant metronomic drip from the levels above.
The smell was the worst part. The usual tang of ozone and rust was being smothered by that other scent, the signature of the murmuration. Sweetness like honeyed blossoms, yet underpinned by the dark, loamy smell of decay. It was the scent of life feeding on death, and it was growing stronger with every new voice that joined the choir, with every soul that surrendered to the water. The air grew thick, humid, cloying. Joric felt it coat his throat, a phantom sweetness that bypassed his rebreather's filters. Or was it a phantom? The spores from his earlier exposure, the concentrated burst in the access tunnel. He could feel them, a dormant colony in his own lungs, stirring in sympathy with the song. He forced himself to focus, to document. Symptomology, immediate pupillary dilation, slackening of facial muscles, onset of auditory glossolalia, coalescing into a unified chant. He was a scientist, a debunker. This was data. This was a plague of the mind, and he was here to trace its etiology. He would not be swayed by the stagecraft. He would... Someone in the crowd was not singing. His eyes snapped to the figure, a small point of stillness in the swaying, ecstatic mass. A child. Standing on the far side of the plaza, near the corroded struts of a collapsed sky bridge. She was wearing a simple shift, a pale color that seemed to push back against the oppressive blue-green glow of the cistern. She wasn't looking at the water. She was looking up, at him. Joric's heart seized, a cold, brutal fist clenched around it. It was impossible. He keyed the magnification on his ocular implant, the world swimming in a haze of orange data points before resolving. The rebreather suddenly felt tight, the air too thin, too hot. His breath hitched. No, 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 no. It was Liana. Not a ghost, not a memory flicker at the edge of his vision. Her. Solid. Real. The way her dark hair curled just behind her ears. The slight, thoughtful cant of her head. He could see the patched seam on the shoulder of her shift where he'd tried to mend it after she'd torn it climbing the reclamation conduits back home, back before the deluge, before everything was water and sorrow. An insignificant, forgotten detail seared into his memory, now rendered with impossible fidelity 60 meters away, across a plaza of chanting zealots.
Induced hallucination, his mind screamed, a desperate final defense. Potent psychotropic spores, target-specific memory projection based on synaptic resonance. It's the fungus, it's not real. But her eyes were not the vacant, blissful saucers of the bloomed. They were clear, they were intelligent, and they were fixed on him with a look of profound, heartbreaking recognition. And then she smiled. It wasn't the playful, gap-toothed smile he cherished in his memory. This was a different smile. It was serene. It was knowing. It was an expression of perfect peace, of a soul unburdened by pain or fear or loss. It was the smile of the converted. In her eyes, he saw an invitation, an assurance. It doesn't have to hurt anymore, Daddy. The thought wasn't his. It bloomed in his mind, seeded there from across the chasm, spoken in her voice, yet carried on the fungal hymn. His fortress of logic, of nihilism, of carefully cultivated meaninglessness was breached. The foundations, built over decades of grief, cracked and gave way. This wasn't just a pathogen. It wasn't just a biological imperative. It had taken his daughter. It had taken his most sacred pain and twisted it into a recruitment poster. Liana raised a small hand, not a wave of greeting, but of benediction.
of farewell. And then she dissolved. One moment she was solid, a perfect, agonizing recreation of his lost world. The next, her form unraveled, breaking apart, not into smoke, but into a shimmering network of glowing mycelial threads. The threads held her shape for a single incandescent heartbeat, a constellation in the form of a child, pulsing once with the sickly blue-green light of the murmuration. Then, with a soft visual sigh, the light threads were drawn back into the oppressive gloom, reabsorbed into the city's fungal haze, leaving nothing behind but a ghost image burned onto his retinas. Joric's control shattered. A sound tore from his throat, a raw, ragged noise that was more animal than human. It was the sound of a man who had spent a lifetime insisting the universe was empty, only to have it show him his personal ghost and prove him wrong in the cruelest way imaginable. He staggered back from the railing, hands flying to his helmet, clawing at the seals as if he could tear the image out of his own mind. "Liana!"
The name was a shard of glass in his throat. The world tilted, the gantry swaying beneath him. The humming of the crowd, the dripping of the water, the hiss of his own stolen breath, it all collapsed into a singular, overwhelming roar. He fell to his knees, the impact jarring his teeth. The sterile, detached observer was gone, replaced by a father seeing his daughter die for a second time. And this time she had smiled as she left. The air in the airy central command was a lie. It tasted of nothing, a sterile void engineered to mimic a purity that no longer existed anywhere on Earth. It was cold, recycled, and carried the faint ozone tang of overworked atmospheric scrubbers. Before Commander Kalen Rask, a wall of hollow screens bathed the polished white polymer floor in a chaotic dance of greasy blues and sickly greens. Each screen was a wound, bleeding data from the city's festering underbelly. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, posture rigid, a living pillar of the structured survivalism he enforced. The only sounds were the low-frequency hum of the city's lifeblood pumps, the heartbeat, and the storm of static crackling from the primary audio feed. "Commander," a nervous tech whispered from his station. "Asset Kantor's biometric feed is, erratic. Adrenaline saturation at 93%. Cardiac stress warnings are—" "I can read the data, Ensign." Kalen's voice was flat, cutting through the low tension in the room like a scalpel. The ensign flinched and returned his gaze to his console. Kalen's eyes remained fixed on the largest screen, the one displaying the fractured first-person view from Joric Kantor's body cam. The image was a nauseating smear of motion, a glimpse of rusting metal catwalk slick with moisture, a flash of pulsating fungal luminescence, the rhythmic, panicked bob of a man running for his life. Kalen's jaw tightened. This was not an investigation. This was a rout. He saw Kantor's spore saturation level, a small amber number in the corner of the display, tick upward. 12%, 13%. Each percentage point was a victory for the contagion, a degradation of his asset. Joric was a tool, a specialized probe designed to analyze and dismantle faith. He was not a soldier, and his present emotional state was a catastrophic system malfunction.
Through the static, he could hear the ragged, desperate breaths of the sump diver, Morrow. He could hear Elora, the child, let out a choked sob. And underneath it all, a sound that didn't belong, a wet, chittering harmony that grated on the ear, the call of the bloomed. Kalen tapped the console beside him, opening a direct priority channel to Kantor's comm unit. His voice, when he spoke, was a chilled counterpoint to the chaos on screen. "Kantor, report status. Provide objective analysis of hostiles." The only reply was a burst of static and a muffled curse.
The camera feed lurched violently as Joric stumbled, catching himself on a dripping wall. For a second, the lens focused on a shape coalescing from the gloom. It was vaguely humanoid, its limbs elongated and twisted. Curtains of glowing mycelium pulsed beneath its translucent skin, and where its head should have been, a grotesque floral blossom of fungus bloomed, its petals quivering. "Salt rot!" The voice was Morrow's, sharp with terror. "They're flanking us! How are they flanking us?" Kalen's fingers drummed a silent, angry rhythm on the console's edge. They were flanking them because they were not mindless animals. They were a network. Joric's own preliminary reports had suggested as much, a possibility Kalen had dismissed as intellectual vanity, the theologian seeing patterns where there was only pathogenic instinct. The data streaming onto his screen now suggested otherwise. Coordinated movement, tactical envelopment. It was illogical. Fungi did not employ flanking maneuvers. "Kantor," Kalen repeated, his voice colder, harder. "Control your team. Withdraw to extraction point Beta. Now. Acknowledge." "No time! The whole transit junction is— Oh, God!" Joric's voice finally came through, strained and breathless. The camera swung wildly, showing a dozen more of the glowing figures emerging from the flooded darkness of a transit tunnel, their movements unnervingly synchronized. Kalen watched the tactical map. Joric's position indicator was a blinking red dot, surrounded by a rapidly expanding cluster of hostile signals. Extraction point Beta was compromised. So was Gamma. The containment strategy, his strategy, had failed. The infection was learning faster than he could sterilize it. Frustration, an emotion he despised as a decadent luxury, burned like acid in his gut.
This entire endeavor had been a concession, a political necessity to appease the factions on the council who still believed in humane solutions. He had always known the truth. You don't reason with a plague, you burn it out. Kantor was meant to provide the justification, the proof that this new god was just a disease. Instead, he had become another symptom. Then it happened. The camera feed steadied for a horrifying moment. Morrow, the sump diver, was shoving a pack into Joric's hands. Her voice came through the comm, shockingly clear, devoid of fear. For the kid, she should know what the sun was. Kalen watched, detached, as she activated something on her belt. A flash of brilliant white light overloaded the camera's sensor. The audio feed peaked with the deafening roar of an explosion, followed by the tortured groan of collapsing metal and concrete. And then the scream. It wasn't a shout of exertion or a cry of fear. It was a raw, primal shriek of absolute psychic agony, ripped from Joric Kantor's throat. It was the sound of a mind breaking. Simultaneously, every one of Joric's vitals on the screen went blood red. Cardiac arrhythmia, adrenaline toxicity critical, synaptic failure imminent. The spore saturation number jumped, flickering past 25%, the clinical threshold for irreversible psychological compromise. In the sterile quiet of the command center, the scream echoed for a moment before being cut off by a wave of static. The ensign who had spoken earlier looked physically ill. Kalen's face, which had been a mask of controlled frustration, went utterly blank. The frustration was gone, burned away, and replaced by the cold, clear certainty of protocol. The mission was a failure. The asset was a loss. The experiment in subtlety
was over. He turned away from the screen, his back to the flickering image of Joric's madness. He faced his second-in-command, Lieutenant Eva Rostova, whose own face was pale under the UV lights. "Lieutenant," Kalen said. His voice was unnervingly calm, the voice of a man resetting a board. "Terminate Operation Hymnal. All field teams are to pull back to the Gamma 9 checkpoint wall, immediately." And Asset Kantor, sir?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper.
Kalen looked at her, his eyes like chips of pre-deluge glass. Forensic theologian Kantor is no longer a BCA asset. His feed is to be firewalled from this command. Redesignate his status to sump-tainted, Category Gamma. The operational meaning hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Category Gamma was not for the merely infected. It was for those who posed a direct cognitive threat to the security of Benthos. It was a kill-on-sight designation. "And if a retrieval team finds him alive," Rostova pressed, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. Kalen allowed a moment of silence to answer for him. "Then he is subject to mandatory retrieval for full psychological purging. His knowledge of our response protocols makes him an unacceptable risk in his current state." Psych purging, a clinical term for a procedure that left its subjects as little more than breathing automata. It was not a recovery. It was a humane alternative to incineration. Without another word, Kalen moved to the central holographic map of Benthos. He swiped a hand through the air, dismissing the frantic, microscopic view of the transit station where his best debunker had just been mentally shattered. He expanded the view, encompassing the entirety of the weeping Gill-Racks and the flooded bloom deeps. The spreading blush of the murmuration was a cancer on the map, a cancer that refused surgical removal. Fine. It was time for chemotherapy. It was time for fire. The air on the gantry was thick enough to drink. It tasted of ozone from a nearby arcing conduit, wet iron, and something else, something new. A cloying sweetness, like honey left to ferment in a grave. Joric's hands trembled on the corroded safety rail of the walkway overlooking Salt-Stained 7. His knuckles were white, but it did nothing to stop the shaking. Below him there was no riot, no panic. There was only a profound, unnatural stillness. Hundreds of Gill-Rackers, damps who minutes ago had been screaming for their rationed water, now stood in a placid, silent congregation around the cistern's edge. The vast concrete basin, usually filmed with rust-colored algae and chemical scum, now shimmered with an impossible clarity. The water was pure. He'd seen it happen. He'd seen the bloom of pale green light spread from Silas's hands, a wave of fungal luminescence that had scoured the water clean in seconds. A miracle. Salt rot, it was a miracle. And he'd seen her.
The thought was a physical blow, a pressure behind his eyes. Anya. Her smile, not the faded memory from a pre-deluge photograph, but vivid and real, superimposed over the crowd. "It's okay, Daddy." The spores. He knew it was the spores. A targeted psychotropic agent, nothing more. A pathogen hijacking the brain's grief centers. His training, the cold logic of structured survivalism that had been his shield for 2 decades, supplied the diagnosis with clinical precision. Yet the warmth of her phantom presence lingered, a stark contrast to the perpetual damp chill that clung to his skin. He lifted his right hand. Under the greasy orange emergency lighting, his palm seemed to glitter with a fine, faintly glowing dust. The point of contact, where the spore burst, had hit him. He felt tainted, violated. But a deeper, more heretical part of him felt touched, chosen. He scrubbed the palm against his trousers, a frantic, useless gesture. The shimmering dust only smeared, catching the light like crushed pearls. A burst of static erupted from his wrist, making him flinch. The sound was a violation of the scene's holy quiet. His BCA communicator, a scarred band of black polymer, flickered to life. "Kantor, report." Kalen Rask's voice sliced through the humid air, tinny and devoid of warmth. It was a voice engineered in the sterile towers of the Eyrie, a voice that had never known the taste of recycled algae paste or the fear of a groaning support beam. Joric swallowed, his throat dry. He tried to form the words. Mass conversion event, pathogen vector confirmed, prophet identified. The standard lexicon of his trade. The words felt like ash in his mouth. "Kantor, do you read me? What is your status? Spore counts in your sector just went off the scale." Joric looked down again. He saw the pure water. He saw the faces of the hymners, upturned, their expressions not of mindless zealotry, but of an immense, soul-deep relief, the kind of relief he hadn't felt since before the deluge, before the world drowned and took his family with it. They were no longer damps, beaten down by the city's slow decay. They were beatified. They were free from the gnawing dread that was the very foundation of life in Benthos. The cistern is clean," Joric heard himself say, his voice a hoarse croak. There was a moment of dead air from the communicator. Kalen was likely processing the sheer absurdity of the statement. "Elaborate, Kantor. Clean is not a tactical designator. The water, it's potable. He purified it. Negative. That is not possible. You have been exposed, Kantor. Your assessment is compromised. The pathogen is hallucinogenic. You are to withdraw immediately. Fall back to checkpoint Delta. A purity team is en route for decontamination." Withdraw. Decontamination. The words echoed in the vast, dripping chamber. He would be scrubbed raw, pumped full of antivirals and immunosuppressants. They would scour every trace of the spores from his body. They would scour her from his mind. The thought was a sudden sharp panic. They would take Anya away from him again. He looked at his hand, at the faint, shimmering dust. His life's work was to prove this was all a lie, a disease to be cured. But the cure felt like a different kind of death, a return to the gray, meaningless reality where his daughter was just a box of cold ashes. The murmuration had offered him a glimpse of heaven, and the BCA was offering him the sterile logic of an empty room. "Kantor, acknowledge the order." Kalen's voice was sharper now, cutting. "You will sever contact with the infected populace and withdraw to the designated extraction point. This is a direct command. Your mission is terminated." Terminated. Joric's gaze drifted from his hand, across the blissful faces below, and landed on the far side of the cistern. He could almost see her there, a shimmering afterimage against a rust-stained wall, smiling that same impossible smile. The murmuration didn't just create visions, it listened. It understood his deepest wound and offered a balm. That made it more than a pathogen. That made it something else, something he had to understand, even if it destroyed him. His fear was real.
the fear of finding a truth he couldn't debunk, a God he couldn't dismiss as a fungus. But for the first time, a new, more terrifying fear eclipsed it, the fear of retreating, the fear of going back to the area and spending the rest of his life wondering if the ghost he saw was more real than the world he lived in.
His trembling stopped. A cold, obsessive resolve settled in his bones, heavier and more solid than the concrete and steel around him. This was no longer a contract. This was no longer a job. It was an exorcism in reverse. He brought the communicator close to his lips. His breath hitched. No. The word was barely audible, a puff of defiant air against the device's sensor. Kalen must have heard it, or sensed the insubordination, because the speaker crackled with an incipient command, his name forming on the other end. Joric didn't let him finish. With a snarl that felt ripped from a part of him he thought long dead, he tore the communicator from his wrist, the strap biting into his skin. He raised it high, the small device seeming pathetic against the cavernous scale of the cistern, and he brought it down against the pitted iron of the railing. The first strike was a dull crack of polymer, the second a splintering crunch. On the third he put all the weight of his grief, his rage, his sudden terrifying hope. The device shattered. Sparks flew, a brief orange constellation against the gloom, and the small status light blinked out. Kalen's voice was gone, replaced by the metronomic drip of water and the low, constant hum of the city's heartbeat. Silence. He was cut off. A heretic, a sump-tainted fugitive. He stood alone on the gantry, his link to the Eyrie, to his old life, severed and lying in pieces at his feet. He looked down at the pure water, the scent of honey and rot filling his lungs, not as a threat, but as an invitation. His mission wasn't terminated. It had just begun. The air in the Gill-Racks was a physical weight, thick with the ozone tang of failing scrubbers and the cloying sweetness of rot. Joric pulled the collar of his worn utility jacket higher, a useless gesture. The dampness here wasn't like the sterile humidity of the Eyrie's atmospheric controls. It was a living thing, a greasy film that clung to skin and soul, carrying the market's thousand stinks. It smelled of frying algae paste, of unwashed bodies pressed close, of rust, and beneath it all, the honeyed decay of the murmuration's distant blossoms. He was a ghost here, a foreigner in his own city. His movements were too precise, his gaze too direct. The damps flowed around him like water around a stone, a chaotic current of humanity that recognized him as an obstruction. Every sideways glance felt like an accusation, every muttered curse a verdict. Fugitive. The word branded on his public record by Kalen's decree was a phantom limb he couldn't stop trying to touch. Thorne's face, serene even as the BCA enforcers dragged him away, flashed behind his eyes. A mentor sacrificed, a truth buried. And Joric, its sole inheritor, was running for his life. He found a recess beside a reclamation pipe that shuddered with the city's heartbeat, the constant low-frequency hum of the master pumps that was the only lullaby Benthos had ever known. From this alcove of shadow, he watched. The market was a tapestry woven from desperation. Stalls cobbled from scavenged plating displayed wares under the stark orange glare of emergency lighting and the sickly green-blue glow of cultivated bioluminescent fungi. A vendor hawked refurbished breather cartridges, his voice a hoarse rasp. 2 levels down, a brawl erupted over a dropped ration bar, a brief, savage explosion of violence that ended as quickly as it began. This was structured survivalism stripped of its philosophical pretensions. This was the tooth and the claw, coated in a slimy sheen of perpetual drizzle from the levels above. His clinical mind, his last shield against the encroaching panic, began to categorize, to analyze. He wasn't looking for goods, he was looking for a node, a hub, in this network of whispers and illicit trade. His gaze swept past the merchants of sustenance and hardware, settling on the fringes. There, a stall that sold nothing. It was just a slab of rusted metal set into a concrete buttress, a figure hunched behind it, their face lost in the steam rolling off a neighboring noodle cart. There was no inventory, no hawking, only a slow, steady trickle of patrons. They would lean in, speak a few words into the shadows, and slide something across the counter. No goods were exchanged. They would simply nod and disappear back into the throng, their shoulders set with new purpose. An information broker. The city's festering wound had its own nervous system. Joric felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was it. The first step off the map, into the dark.
He pushed off from the wall, forcing his stride to mimic the tired shuffle of the damps around him. He kept his eyes down, focused on the slick, grated floor, tracking the rivulets of condensation that traced paths toward the chasm's edge. He could feel the ghost of his daughter's hand in his, a memory so vivid, so charged with the spore's insidious chemistry that it was nearly real. "You have to go deeper, Daddy." Her voice was a clean, pure note in the discordant symphony of the market. It was that voice that propelled him forward. He reached the stall. The air here was thick with the smell of boiled kelp and something acrid like burnt circuitry. The figure didn't move. Joric could make out only a silhouette, a tangle of matted hair and the glint of cybernetics around one temple. He waited. Nothing. The broker's attention was fixed on a point in the middle distance, a study in absolute stillness. He was being tested. An airy accent would get him knifed. A show of authority would get him ignored. Joric reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. His fingers closed around the cool, heavy disk of a pre-deluge credit chit. Untraceable physical currency, a relic from his father's collection, a contingency for a day he never thought would come. He placed it on the counter. The sound was a soft, metallic click that cut through the noise of the market. The broker's head tilted, a slow, reptilian movement. "I need passage," Joric said, his voice a low rasp he barely recognized. "Passage down." The broker's hand, thin and grimy, slid out from the shadows. The fingers were tipped with polished steel. They tapped the chit once, twice. A dry, scraping sound echoed in the small space between them. "The deeps are a grave." The voice was a synthesized rasp, filtered through a cheap vocoder. "Not a destination." "I'm not a tourist," Joric replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. The hallucination of his daughter was stronger now, standing just behind his shoulder, her presence a cold spot in the humid air. "I need someone who knows the submerged arteries, the old ways, someone the BCA doesn't own." The steel-tipped fingers drummed a frantic, silent rhythm on the counter. "The ones the authority doesn't own are owned by something else, something older. You have the look of a man running from his own sins, airy man. Down there, sins learn how to swim." Joric leaned closer, the smell of ozone from the broker's cybernetics sharp in his nostrils. "I'm not looking for absolution. I'm looking for a sunk diver." The word hung in the air. It was a curse and a title, a name for those who flirted with the bloom deeps for salvage and survival, and usually lost. The broker's fingers stopped drumming. For the first time, the shadowed head turned, and Joric saw two pinpricks of red light where eyes should be. A diver, The vocoder rasped, a sound like grinding rust. "You don't want a diver, you want a ghost. A suicidal artist who paints with scavenged explosives and navigates by the groans of dying buildings." The broker's hand slowly, deliberately pushed the credit chit back toward Joric. "This won't be enough, not for her." Joric's resolve hardened. "It's a down payment, for a name." The red optics seemed to bore through him, cataloging his desperation, weighing it. The broker let the silence stretch, a form of torture in the cacophonous market. Finally, the figure leaned forward, the synthesized voice dropping to the lowest possible frequency, a mere vibration in the air. "There is one. Doesn't work for corn. Works for memory. Pre-deluge scraps. Stories. Things that remember the sun." The broker paused, letting the absurdity of the request sink in. "Find the maintenance winch at Sump Access Gamma 7. It overlooks the Black Vein Chasm. Leave a tribute, something for a child. She collects them. If she accepts, she'll find you. If she doesn't, I'd advise you to jump." "A name," Joric insisted, his own voice now a whisper. "I need a name." The broker's steel-tipped finger tapped the chit one last time. "Morocade." The name felt heavy, like a stone. Morocade. Joric took the chit, his mission crystallized into 2 words. He gave a curt nod, a gesture of thanks that felt entirely out of place, and turned. The broker was already looking away, his transaction complete, Joric already a ghost, fading back into the crowd.
He didn't stop moving until he was at the edge of the market platform, a rusty railing the only thing between him and a 100-meter drop into darkness. Below, emergency lights reflected off a vast, still expanse of black water that had claimed the city's lower third, the Bloom Deeps. Somewhere down in that cold, silent abyss, in that forest of drowned skyscrapers and singing fungus, was his answer, and Morocade was the key. His cautious desperation had burned away, leaving something colder, sharper. He was no longer just a fugitive. He was a supplicant, preparing to make an offering at the edge of the world. The name on the rusted bulkhead had been The Gulp, a crude joke for a place that sat so low in the city's guts, perpetually threatened with being swallowed by the rising, toxic sea. The circular hatch, salvaged from a pre-deluge freighter, groaned on protesting hinges, releasing a hiss of pressurized recycled air that stank of ozone and something metallic, like blood and old batteries. Joric stepped through, and the hatch wheezed shut behind him, the sound of the locking bolts echoing with a heavy finality. He was in. His apprehension was a cold, physical thing, a knot tightening just below his ribs. This was not the sterile, controlled decay of the upper Gill-Racks. This was the waterline, the frontier. The air itself was a tangible presence, a cocktail of scents fighting for dominance. The sweet, cloying perfume of fungal rot clinging to boots and clothes. The sharp tang of cheap synth ale, the sweat of unwashed bodies, and beneath it all, the ever-present hum of the city's heartbeat, a vibration felt more in the bones than in the ears. The bar was a repurposed ballast tank, its curved walls weeping condensation that traced greasy paths through decades of grime. Light was a miserable commodity, provided by a few flickering orange emergency strips and the ghostly blue-green bioluminescence of fungal cultures growing in cracked jars on the tables, a sump diver's version of candlelight.
The patrons were exactly what he'd expected, and yet somehow worse. They were creatures of the deep city, their faces pale maps of hardship, their bodies often augmented with crude, functional cybernetics. A man with a pitted brass voice box laughed, a sound like gravel in a grinder. A woman with milky, sightless eyes ran a scarred hand over a set of polished vertebrae she used for a drinking game. They were all sump-tainted, one way or another, hardened by pressure, polished by desperation. They turned to look at him as one, a pack of deep-sea predators sensing a surface dweller in their midst. Joric could feel their collective gaze picking him apart, his clothes, too clean despite his recent ordeal, his posture, too rigid with airy discipline, the scent of recycled, filtered air that still clung to him like a brand. He forced himself to breathe, to push down the instinct to retreat. His faith was in logic, in the observable, repeatable fact that existence was a cruel accident. These people were merely another data point proving his thesis, life clinging to the edge of a meaningless abyss. The thought was a familiar shield, but here, in the oppressive damp, it felt thin, brittle. The hallucination of his daughter's hand in his was a phantom limb, an ache that defied all logic. He scanned the room, his eyes moving past the drinkers and gamblers. He wasn't looking for a drunk with a death wish. He was looking for a professional, a survivor. And then he saw her. Tucked into a recess in the tank's curved wall, away from the main cluster of tables, sat a lone figure. She wasn't drinking. She wasn't talking. She was working. A portable lumen cast a sterile white circle of light on a disassembled rebreather unit, its complex guts spread across an oil-stained cloth. Her hands moved with a surgeon's precision, wiry, calloused fingers cleaning a valve here, testing a seal there. One of her arms, from the elbow down, was a piece of unadorned, functional machinery. Not the sleek, myomer-laced prosthetics of the airy, but a brutalist assembly of pistons, wires, and grasping claws that whirred softly with each meticulous movement. She was lean, her face a collection of sharp angles and watchful stillness, framed by dark hair cropped short for practicality. She embodied the place, hard, efficient, and utterly devoid of sentiment. This had to be her, Morrow Cade.
As if feeling his stare, she paused, her cybernetic hand hovering over a pressure gauge. She looked up, and her eyes met his across the dim, smoky room. There was no curiosity in her gaze, no welcome, just a flat, cold assessment. He was an anomaly, a problem, a loose variable in her controlled world. The suspicion was so potent, it was almost a physical force pushing him back. Joric knew that look. It was the look of someone who had survived by trusting no one, by calculating every risk down to the last calibrated liter. He started across the grated metal floor, his boots echoing in the sudden quiet. The low conversations had dwindled to whispers. The air grew heavier. Each step was an intrusion. He could feel the weight of a dozen gazes on his back, but he kept his focus on the woman in the corner. His apprehension was slowly, unexpectedly, being replaced by something else. A guarded, clinical respect. She wasn't just another sump-tainted scavenger. She was a master of her craft, and her life support system was her hymnal. He could appreciate that level of devotion to the tangible. He stopped a respectable distance from her makeshift workbench. He didn't want to crowd her. Animals this wary were prone to biting. "I'm looking for a sump diver," he said, his voice sounding too formal, too airy in the thick air of the gulp. Morrow didn't answer immediately. She picked up a small canister, her gaze fixed on its seal, her cybernetic fingers turning it with precise, delicate clicks. "Lots of divers here," she said, her voice a low rasp, dry as rust. She didn't look at him. "I was told to find the best," Joric pressed, keeping his tone even. Someone who can navigate the bloom deeps. Someone who isn't afraid of the whispers. This earned him a reaction. She stopped working. Slowly, deliberately, she placed the canister down and wiped her organic hand on a rag. She turned her head and, for the first time, gave him her full attention. Her eyes were the color of the silk-choked water that surrounded Benthos. Afraid is how you stay alive down there. Only fools and sporeheads aren't afraid. You don't look like a sporehead. Her gaze flickered over him again, more intense this time. So that just leaves fool. Joric felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. I have a contract, a high-yield one, calibrated liters, enough to buy a passage to the Eyrie, if that's what you want.
A sound that might have been a laugh but held no humor escaped her lips. It was a short, sharp puff of air. The Eyrie. Right, so I can choke on clean air and die of boredom. Stay dry, Pure. She picked up her tool, dismissing him. The silent judgment of the room seemed to press in, savoring his failure. It's not just a contract, Joric said, his voice dropping lower, a note of the desperation he'd been suppressing finally bleeding through. It's about the source, the heart of the murmuration. You guide me, and I can give you the truth about what's really growing in the dark. Her cybernetic hand, which had been about to tighten a fitting, froze mid-motion. For a full 10 seconds, she was perfectly still, a predator scenting something on the wind. The low hum of the pumps seemed to swell in the silence. Finally, she set the tool down with a soft, deliberate click. She looked at his face, then at his hands, then back to his eyes, searching for the telltale shimmer of the whispering sickness, for the lie, for the trap. The truth, she repeated, the words tasting like a foreign language on her tongue. The truth doesn't pay for oxygen filters. What's the real job, Pure? Who are you running from? The gulp wasn't a place. It was a wound in the wall of the Gill-Racks, a festering pocket of space where the ozone tang of failing scrubbers surrendered to the scent of frying algae paste and something acrid that might have been alcohol. Joric sat in a booth carved from a repurposed water conduit, the curved metal sweating under the perpetual humidity. Every surface held a greasy film of condensation. He ran a finger over the table, leaving a clean streak in the grime, then instinctively wiped it on his trousers. A pointless gesture. The filth of this place was atmospheric, inhaled with every breath. He watched the door. Damps shuffled in and out, their faces pale and slick in the sickly green glow of a cracked light panel overhead. They moved with a weariness that was structural, bone deep. They didn't look at him, but he felt their awareness, the slightly too clean fabric of his jacket, the straightness of his posture, the way he didn't hunch against the constant metronomic drip of water from a stained pipe above. He was an antigen in their world, a topsider slumming for reasons they could only assume were perverse.
Then she came through the door, and the ambient noise of the room seemed to dip for a fraction of a second. Morwen Cade. Morrow. She was exactly as the whispers described her, wiry and compact, wrapped in layers of waterproofed canvas and worn synth leather. Her face was a sharp map of angles and old scars, dominated by eyes that held the flat, patient look of a predator. Her left arm was a brutalist piece of engineering, scavenged hydraulics and exposed cabling from elbow to fingertips. It whirred softly as she scanned the room, a sound like an insect trapped in a jar. Her gaze landed on him, held for a moment without surprise, and she moved toward his booth with an efficient, ground-eating stride that wasted no energy. She slid onto the bench opposite him without a word, the worn material of her gear sighing against the metal. The cybernetic arm rested on the table with a solid thud, its chrome fingers drumming a silent, irregular pattern. Up close, Joric could see the intricate repair work, the places where mismatched wiring was held together with hardened resin. It wasn't a piece of airy tech. It was a tool, maintained through sheer will. "You've been asking around," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together underwater. "Makes a person conspicuous." Joric pushed a small palm-sized flask across the grimy table. It was filled with purified water, a vulgar display of wealth down here. "My apologies. Discretion isn't my primary skill." Morrow looked at the flask, then back at him. She didn't touch it. A faint, humorless smile touched her lips. "A topsider with manners. What's next? You gonna tell me the sky isn't poison?" She leaned forward, the scent of brine and ozone clinging to her. "So, you found me. What ghost are you chasing, suit?" Joric took a steadying breath, the image of his daughter's face, pale and shimmering in a cloud of spores, flashing behind his eyes. He pushed it down. He had to be clinical. This was a transaction. "I need a guide," he said, his voice tight. "Into the Bloom deeps. I have the precise coordinates, a sub-level transit nexus directly below the epicenter of the Gamma-9 pump failure." Morrow stared at him. Her chrome fingers stopped their drumming. Then she threw her head back and laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was sharp and broken, full of rust and disbelief.
"Salt rot, of course you do." She shook her head, her eyes glittering with derision. "A tourist, I should have known. You want to go sightseeing in hell, is that it? Get a little thrill to tell your pure friends about back in your sterile box in the clouds?" "This isn't tourism," Joric said, his control fraying at the edges. "No? Then what is it?" she shot back, leaning across the table, her voice dropping to a harsh, confidential tone. "Because let me tell you what's down there, topsider. It's not just dark and wet. The bulkheads around the Gamma-9 breach are groaning. They scream all day. We hear it on the hydrophones. The water is a hot soup of every chemical the BCA has ever flushed, and it's crawling with things that don't have names yet. And the bloomed. They aren't the shambling hymners you see up here. They're faster now. They think. They hunt. Going there isn't a risk. It's a meticulously planned suicide." She sat back, crossing her arms, one flesh, one metal. "So no, I'm not for hire." The finality in her voice was like a slammed vault door. For a moment, Joric felt the abyss open beneath him. The thought of returning to Kylan with nothing, of letting that vision of his daughter fester in his mind, unchallenged, was impossible. It was a physical torment. His own carefully constructed nihilism was a crumbling dam, and that hallucination was the flood. His desperation, hot and sharp, broke through the surface. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. He met her gaze, and for the first time, he let her see the raw obsession churning inside him. "I don't care about the risk," he said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the pumps. "I don't care if the bulkheads turn to dust. I don't care what's swimming in that filth. I have to get there." He slid his wrist interface across the table, the screen glowing orange. On it was a figure that made Morrow's eyes widen almost imperceptibly. "That's the down payment," Joric said, "in calibrated liters. Transferred on departure. Another 50% upon arrival at the coordinates. The final 50% when you get me out." Morrow looked from the number on the screen to Joric's face. The derision in her eyes was gone, replaced by a sharp, analytical curiosity. She wasn't looking at the money anymore. She was looking at him. She was a scavenger,
a survivor. She knew the value of things, and she was seeing something in him far more valuable, far more reliable than calls. Absolute, irrational need. A man this haunted wouldn't be spooked by shadows. He was the shadow. She was silent for a long time. The only sounds were the drip, drip, drip from the ceiling and the faint, almost sub-aural whir of her own arm. "A payment that big tells me two things," she finally said, her voice now cold and devoid of any emotion. "First, whatever you're looking for, the BCA wants it found or buried. Second, you don't expect to come back." "My expectations are irrelevant," Joric countered. "I'm hiring you for your expertise in survival, not my own." Morrow held his gaze, and Joric felt like a specimen under a microscope. She was dissecting his motives, weighing his madness against the structural integrity of a drowned world. The suspicion was still there, a hard kernel of distrust, but it was now wrapped in a layer of cold, professional calculation. The emotional shift was palpable, a change of pressure, like the air before a hull breach. She slowly pulled her arm back from the table. She looked at his untouched flask of pure water and gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "No," she said again. Joric's heart seized. She stood up, her presence seeming to fill the small booth. "The price you're offering is for a guide, a good one." She turned to leave, then paused, looking back at him over her shoulder. Her eyes were chips of obsidian. "The price to take a man to his own grave is higher. You can find me when you're ready to pay it." And then she was gone, melting back into the humid gloom of the gulp. Joric was left alone in the booth, the echo of her words hanging in the air. It was a refusal, but it was also an invitation. He stared at the empty space where she had been, the hum of the city's dying heart beating in his ears, and knew this was the only way down. The booth in the gulp was a cramped alcove of rust-stained metal and weeping polymer, slick with the perpetual condensation of the Gill-Racks. Every surface had a greasy sheen under the flickering orange of a dying emergency strip. The air was thick enough to chew, a foul cocktail of ozone from the failing scrubbers above, the briny reek of algae paste from the bar, and something else. The cloying honey and rot perfume of the murmuration that clung to everything in this part of the city. It was the scent of his own personal ghost. Across the table, Morwen Cade stirred her bowl of murky, protein-rich broth with a deliberate slowness that grated on Joric's frayed nerves. The rhythmic clink of her spoon against the cheap ceramic was another layer in the symphony of decay. The metronomic drip, drip, drip of water into a bucket in the corner, the low-frequency groan of the city's superstructure, and the ever-present thrum of the heartbeat pumps vibrating up through the soles of his boots. Morwen didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the swirling contents of her meal, but Joric knew he had her complete, undivided attention. Sump divers didn't survive by being careless. Her face was a roadmap of hard-won years, etched with lines of caution and cynicism. One of her arms, from the elbow down, was a piece of scavenged pre-deluge cybernetics, a mesh of dull gray alloys and exposed myomer cabling that flexed silently as she moved her hand. It was a tool, not an ornament. Joric slid his data slate across the table, the screen glowing with a string of numbers that should have ended any negotiation. 250,000 cal liters, half now, half upon completion. Morwen stopped stirring. She looked at the slate, then slowly lifted her eyes to meet Joric's. There was no avarice in them, no excitement, only a flat, diagnostic curiosity, like a mortician sizing up a fresh corpse.
"The job is a simple guide and retrieval," Joric countered, fighting to keep the tremor from his voice. The vision of his daughter, Anna, still shimmered at the edge of his sight, a phantom of light and spore dust. "I need to get to the source node of the gamma-9 bloom, plant a sensor array, get a core sample, and get out." Morrow finally picked up her spoon and took a slow, deliberate sip of the broth. She swallowed, her expression unchanging. "There's no such thing as get out from a source node, Airy. People go into the bloom deeps, they get lost, they get eaten by things that forgot the sun, or they get bloomed. Those are the options. The fungus is thickest there. The whispers, they're not whispers down there. It's a choir. You breathe that air for 10 minutes, and you'll be singing along with them, telling the murmuration every secret you ever had." She leaned forward, the orange light carving deep shadows into her face. "I've seen men with more tactical gear than sense try to punch through. They come back with mycelium growing out of their eye sockets, humming lullabies. So no, your credits are worthless down there." Joric felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. This was his one chance. The BCA wanted him to pull back. Kalen was already mobilizing his purity squads for a purge. Only Joric knew, or suspected, this wasn't just a pathogen. It was something else, something that knew his daughter's name. His obsession was a fire in his veins, burning away the last of his clinical detachment. "This isn't a BCA-sanctioned run," he said, lowering his voice. "This is for me." Morrow leaned back, a flicker of something new in her eyes. Understanding, or maybe pity. "Salt rot. You're spore-struck. I should have smelled it on you. You're not chasing data, are you? You're chasing a ghost." The accusation hit him like a physical blow, because it was. He was chasing the chemical echo of a dead child, and he hated himself for it. "I'm chasing a cure," he lied, the words tasting like ash. "Same thing," she dismissed flatly. She pushed her bowl away, the gesture one of finality. "Find another diver, one who's younger, dumber, and needs the cows more than their own mind. Stay dry, Airy." She started to slide out of the booth. Panic, cooled and sharp, lanced through Joric. He couldn't lose her. The rumors were clear. No one knew the submerged pathways, the dead zones, and the murmuration's hunting grounds like Morrow Cade. Wait. His hand shot out, not to grab her, but to place a heavy cylindrical object on the table between them. It was matte black, made of a polymer that didn't exist outside an airy fabrication lab. It was perfectly sealed, completely free of the grime and moisture that coated everything else in the room. A single, clean blue light pulsed softly from its side. Morrow froze, halfway out of her seat. Her eyes, which had dismissed a fortune in credits, were now locked onto the device. She slowly, cautiously, slid back into the booth. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not about the cows," Joric said, his own voice low and intense. "It's about this. This is your payment." He gave the cylinder a slight nudge. It slid silently across the greasy tabletop, a miniature god of purity in a temple of rot. "That's a Series 7, Morrow breathed, her cybernetic fingers twitching. "A personal reclamation unit. Military specification." She looked up at him, her hard-bitten cynicism finally cracking. "They don't issue these. Not even to Kalen Rosk's pet butchers. Where did you get this?" "It was my wife's," Joric said.
the admission costing him more than he expected. She was an atmospheric engineer during the deluge. It's all I have left of her. The lie was only partial. It was his, issued by the authority, but invoking Alara's memory gave it the weight of a sacred relic. It can filter 200 liters of grade 0 toxic sump water a day into potable, airy grade purity. No power source needed. Runs on its own internal fission cell for the next 50 years. It's a well, a personal, portable, endless well. With this, you're not just rich, you're a kingmaker down here. You'd never have to answer to Aqua Veritas or the BCA again. You'd be your own source of purity.
Morrow stared at the device, her face a storm of calculation. Joric could almost see the grim calculus of the sump diver at work. On one side, a near-certain death in a lightless fungal hell. On the other, a lifetime of freedom and power beyond the dreams of any damp. She reached out, not with her human hand, but with the cybernetic one. Her metal fingers hovered over the pristine casing, almost afraid to touch it, to contaminate it. Then she looked at him, truly looked at him, and he knew she wasn't seeing a client anymore. She was seeing the madness he felt coiled behind his ribs. She saw the ghost in his eyes. "One trip," she said, her voice like stone. "We go in, you plant your toys, you get your sample, and we get out. My way, my rules, no arguments." Joric felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled him. "Deal." "Rule 1, she continued, her gaze as hard as steel. "You slow me down, I leave you behind. Rule 2, you start hearing the hymn, you tell me. If you don't, and I see your eyes start to glow, I put a rivet through your skull. The filter is my payment, whether you come back breathing or not. Your body is just the delivery service." She finally closed her metal fingers around the reclamation unit, her grip possessive, final. The pact was sealed. "I understand," Joric said, his throat dry. Morrow hefted the device, its weight seeming to anchor her to this insane agreement. "No, you don't," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "But you will. Meet me at the sump gate of Sector Epsilon at 0400. Come alone, and for salt's sake, try not to get killed before then. It'd be a shame to waste this pretty thing.